Thank you everyone for attending today's session. In today's session, we're going to look at how marine renewable energy can catalyze regenerative industries. The answer should be simple. We should be displacing fossil fuels and reinforcing the processes in the sea that regenerate our economy and give us the processes we need to sustain life. But like everything else, it's a little bit more complicated and there are more moving parts. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So we have two working TAs at ADB on this particular area, and we'll hear from the teams of consultants from those first. And then we'll also be listening to three of our colleagues who are working in this space and trying to implement and scale up these activities. But I suppose, first of all, we need to ask, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to enhance regenerative capacity in our ocean and reverse carbon emissions? So on that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kirsten Issani from IOC UNESCO. Dr. Issani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning, afternoon, evening. So I'm Kirsten Issani from the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, and we are working a lot on ocean acidification, the threat and its status. So what is ocean acidification to start with? When CO2 comes from the air to the seawater, it changes the water chemistry and reduces the pH and carbonate levels in the ocean. To show that a little bit differently, here we have our fossil fuels burning, emitting CO2 to the atmosphere, which then, as we know, causes climate change, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere. Being atmosphere and ocean in equilibrium, around 30% of the annual CO2 emissions go into the sea. And here, I know it's always a little bit disturbing to see those chemical reactions, but it's quite easy. When we have the CO2 in the water, they form bicarbonate, and then the H plus here at the end, this is what reduces the pH. This is what makes our ocean more acidic. So with increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere and in the ocean, we reduce the pH and we reduce the carbonate ions, which if we look at a graph where we are here right now, and we are already in 2022, we have from the pre-industrial times to now, we have an increase of ocean acidity of 30%, a reduction of 16% of carbonate ions, and in 2100, we are looking at a future where we have an increased acidity of 100 to 150%, and a reduction of carbonate ions of roughly 50%. As you can see, the pH scale here only reaches from 8.2 to 7.8, and you are asking, but why is then an increase of acidification of 100 to 150%? This is a logarithmic scale, so it's times 10, and it's small changes in absolute numbers mean huge changes in ocean acidification when we talk about the pH. But okay, chemistry is changing. Are we actually interested in that? And yes, those reduced changes in the carbonate chemistry have multiple impacts on our marine ecosystems and on our human well-being. So, for example, we have in coral reefs, there we observe increased bioerosion, macroalgae overgrowth. There's a change in community structure, shifts in biodiversity. We have less recruitment, so we don't have so much new coral reefs building. And when we look at the pelagic food webs, for example, harmful algae blooms are increasing with higher CO2 levels because they can react very fast, and this increased CO2 is really making them grow very fast and they can benefit from it. But this, of course, in turn has negative impact on tourism, on human well-being, increased toxins in the ocean. But of course, we can also look at other carbonate reefs where we have increased dissolution in macroalgal overgrowth, while on the other hand, some of our marine ecosystems might help to mitigate, so reduce ocean acidification at the local level, such as seagrass, where we see with the increased CO2 levels in the ocean. Here in the seagrass, microhabitat is built, and we have we have an increase in pH. So in general, it can be said we have this global trend of reduced CO2, increased CO2, reduced pH. So ocean acidification is a global condition, but with very local effects. And therefore, we need local through global scale observations in order to get it correct. We need to be coordinated in our work and really do an open analysis and share our data freely. To really meet this global need for increased CO2 and for increased ocean acidification research, the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network was built in 2012, and IOC was partner in that since the beginning, together with Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center and NOAA. And GOAN, as we call it, is a multi-stakeholder network and has three major goals. We are aiming to improve our understanding of the global ocean acidification conditions. So where, how fast, and why, understanding why, which is different in coastal areas sometimes than in the open ocean. The goal two, improve our understanding of the ecosystem response, just what I showed before, which is very complex, given as well that there are other stresses happening at the same time. And especially the biological response is not easy to identify. And how fast is this ecosystem response? And very important as well, where are those places which are extremely vulnerable or even more resilient? Goal three then goes to taking this knowledge to the next steps, improving our predictions, improving our projections for ocean acidification now and in the future, which then, of course, helps to inform future decisions. And as I said, this is a global problem, but of course, actions are most efficient at regional and national levels. So taking it then, this global effort to regional hubs, and GOAN right now is a network of more than 900 scientists in 105 countries. And those are organized often, not all, in regional hubs. And right now we are having 9 regional hubs, and the latest was just formed here in Southeast Asia. And those regional activities are shown to be extremely efficient because people really engage. So, but of course, now we have this network for 10 years, have our 10th anniversary actually this year. But now we have to move forward. We have to go, we are now detecting, but we have to go into the solution space. We have to move forward and really going from the here's a problem to so what, why should we care, and how can we change? So we have the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and within that, GOAN successfully managed to get a decade program, which is Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability, and there we have 7 big outcomes we want to achieve. Under those, it's important for us to really get specific data and evidence to develop mitigation and adaptation strategies from local to global. We are also aiming that the global science community will be equipped to provide the high quality, high quantity, and high resolution ocean acidification data. We are aiming to really have long-term ocean observing systems maintained, but also co-designed by scientists, funders, and end users. And really the risk and severity of ocean acidification impacts on marine ecosystems and ecosystems we hope will be better understood in 10 years and used to support the protection of marine life. We want to have society relevant prediction of the impacts of ocean acidification and those freely available. And we further hope that the public will be more ocean acidification literate. And this is as well something why I'm here to really inform a broader audience about the causes and impacts of ocean acidification. And countries and regions will routinely include measures to reduce ocean acidification in their respective national legislation. So it's really going from the detection to as well to the solution space. So for that, OAS needs to step out of its and go on out of its comfort zone and needs to engage more with governments, national bodies, and partners. And for that, it needs long-term support from national and regional networks to monitor and observe ocean acidification. There's an increased need to invest in future R&D to enhance and increase those observing capabilities and data generation. A lot of our work is really focusing on capacity building and training to broaden and democratize data generation and application. This ability and right and infrastructure is really not equally distributed. Also, having those data we all obtain are freely available and visible and used, and then really have this data knowledge not only produced but also used to underpin policy decision and legislation. So how are we actually funded? And this is also how we work. We are a mixed bag. We are a mixed bag of different organizations, different people investing a lot of time. And so within our network, we have, as I said, those 3 organizations, and there's a lot of in-kind support, and it's really the biggest contribution, time of our executive council, the co-chairs, time of co-sponsoring organizations representatives. We have, and we are quite lucky for that, we have a distributed secretariat who helps to really maintain this network and to develop new activities. And each of those co-sponsoring organizations has one person sitting there, and I'm also quite happy to have one sitting with me. And then we have technical support and those provision really of technology, which can be then deployed and used by a lot of scientists in the world. We have co-sponsors, we have foundations, and we have also direct country support. And this capacity development and training are really quite often happening on a voluntary basis. And of course, that is good to a certain extent, but it's very difficult to maintain. And especially if we want to move forward, if we want to go on now also moving into the ocean acidification research for sustainability, we need to get new partners on board to help us really with the co-design and also co-implementation of ocean acidification research and solutions, so that that we can maintain and increase efforts within OAS to not stop at really stating the problem, but hopefully also addressing it. And I'm very happy that we talk a little bit about this here today, really at the source of ocean acidification. So co-designing future research with information and data users is of high importance. And with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank the team, the more than 960 GOAN members, the Executive Council, the Secretariat, the GOAN co-chairs, and there's quite some information about us, about our efforts online, and happy to answer some questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. There's a great deal going on that, and I think it's quite sobering stuff. I was very thankful that you gave us a presentation, your organisation gave us a presentation a few weeks ago And I did a bit more research and uncovered an article by IUCN that said that the ocean is becoming more acidic at the fastest rate in the last 300 million years, including faster than the great extinction 66.5 million years ago. In fact, the number is about 10 times the speed. So I think we're going to find out a lot in the next couple of years about what's going on, and I'm really glad your organisation's there, and we're going to support and help you as much as we can. Next, we need to move forward to figure out what can we set ourselves up to reverse this activity and also make meaningful change. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Rear Admiral retired from the British Royal Navy, Nick Lambert, who's the founder of NLIA and is also the lead on the MARES TA on marine economy. So Nick, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. And could I just check that you're seeing my title slide?
Yep,
thank you
very
much,
Steve. Good.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to speak about the new ocean economy. And thank you to Kirsten for a salutary presentation. That's the second time I've heard an ocean acidification presentation, and they are, to say the least, thought-provoking. And I thought Kirsten made some really interesting points, picking them out. Global acidification trend with very local effects, and therefore the need for local action on a global scale. And that's really what's happening in the new ocean economy. And I'm going to try and put, to me, there is a positive opportunity. I think we can think about our oceans differently. We now understand so much more about them. And I love the point that Kirsten made about raising public awareness of our oceans, the problems that they face, the things that we've done to them, and the things that we need to address, but also the need for more data, this pressing need for more data. And I often think that we know enough to be really worried about our oceans, but we don't know enough yet about how to fix them. But the thing that does come across more than anything is this is going to take time. And so the programs that we introduce at that local level must be enduring programs, and they must have longevity that will fix the problems in the long term. I'm a huge fan of the UN Decade of the Oceans initiative. I have one slight disagreement with it, or one addition to it. I think it should be the UN Century of the Oceans. 10 years is just scratching the surface. And the other thing is, we've got to get to the terrestrial public. A lot of us spend our times talking to like-minded people. We've really got to get to the terrestrial public. And that's a good news story, because that is beginning to happen. And we're seeing more and more awareness. Certainly Generation Z is aware of it. And then the final point I'm going to make is, it's not about the technology. We've got the technology now, and I'll bring that point out. This is about the boring stuff, and I'll talk about the boring stuff as we go through. So these are the things I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about sea vision. Our oceans are in crisis. How do we turn that around? We're all islanders. And then how we build sustainable blue economies that will address and give us that local action with a global effect. And therefore, we're going to need a regenerative business model. We need investment. We need to seize the commercial opportunities to address our oceans. What allows us to do it? The technology I mentioned. Apollo 8 gave us Earthrise, that stunning photograph. And this presentation on the right is a Spillhouse projection. Now we've got shed loads of satellites whizzing around in low Earth orbit. Yes, I know there's a whole story around space debris and space junk. That's another issue. But the positive from those satellites is they give us an understanding of what's going on our planet. They start to help us get data in. Kirsten couldn't gather data via GoAron if it wasn't for space-based assets, giving her the connectivity. And we have modern GIS, which can take those different data sets and fuse them, and we can handle big data, we can crunch it, and we can analyze it with modern AI techniques. I know that the Spillhouse presentation projection there on the right is not modern GIS. This is a 1942 picture. But this is what lies behind my point that we're all islanders now. We have one ocean. We don't have 5 oceans. We have the bulk of our planet covered by this amazing water mass. We are planet ocean. We're not planet Earth. And we really must think about it, because that terrestrial landmass there is being taxed to the limits now. So there is this danger that we always talk about the ocean in terms of problem statements. We've got 1/3 of our major commercial fish species being fished at biologically unsustainable levels. I'm horrified that people are going in at the bottom of the food chain and taking out plankton. And Lord help us, they're taking out that plankton to feed fish in aquaculture. We've got 600 million people living on land that's threatened by sea rise, and some of the islands that I'll talk about in a moment are worrying about that. And we've just heard the story of ocean acidification. I've put in the middle there John Englander's book about moving to higher ground. This is a handbook for those of us who are going to be affected by rising sea levels. Most people think that's Pacific islands and coral reefs. Actually, for us here in the UK, that's people living in the Oxford area on the Thames estuary, about 40 or 50 miles inland from the sea, who are being affected by rising sea levels. If you live in an estuarine geography, you are being affected by rising sea levels now. That's why we're seeing all these statements about increased atmospheric and meteorological effects at sea, more rogue waves, more destruction of coastlines and so on. John Englander's book has a 100-year time frame to it. And in the back, there's a guide for structural engineers, architects, planners, as to what to do if you are planning to build or to have human habitation in areas of rising sea level. It's a salutary book, but it's also a very positive book, because he turns it round and says, how do we take advantage of this? How do we build the world's major cities, 60% of which are in flooding and coastal zone regions? How do we enable those cities to persist in the future? How do we turn it round and turn it to advantage? And so I wonder whether we now need to start looking at the ocean through an educated lens, a lens which says, I really understand ocean acidification. I understand rising sea levels. I understand the relationship between the sea and the land. I realize that we have one planet. And how do I turn this round, enable our growing population to have a high standard of living, address all the problems that go with that, but at the same time, address our marine environment and have that, that local and global effect that Kirsten talked about. If you want to understand this at a higher level, do read President James Michel's book, Rethinking the Oceans, and this idea of moving towards a blue economy. In the MARES program, which Steve mentioned, we were privileged to have James Michel speak to us a while back. And he has been making this point that the blue economy is this method, this concept through which we will achieve a balance of the marine environment through the social and economic benefits that we can derive from it. And that sounds really big and almost impossible, but we've got to do something about it. We have to be positive about it. We have to find opportunities. And so if we can think about the globe in this way, if we can think about this Spillhouse projection focused beautifully on Antarctica, showing us that we're all islanders. It doesn't really matter if you're the Himalayas. You are an islander. You're surrounded by one ocean, and you are being affected by climate change, and the oceans are affecting you. So there is a real need to understand the natural capital of our seas and oceans, the value of the resources on the seabed, under the seabed, in the water column above it, and in the airspace above that, and particularly that interface between land and sea, that coastal zone, the 100 or so miles inland from the shore, where so much of our population and so much of our productivity exists. And we're really beginning to see publications now and studies which are showing us the resources that we have. They're putting a value on it. The numbers are eye-catching. We're into trillions and trillions numbers. There are some people who say that the world's seas and oceans are valued about the 7th GDP equivalent on the planet. Personally, they're big numbers. We're starting to get a shape to it, but we've still not got a real understanding of the value. What we do know is they are valuable, and we really need to capture that value, understand it, and then realize that we can invest in it and we can get the socioeconomic benefit from it in such a way that we can sustain that valuable resource. A recent UNCTAD report has identified that there's a 2.5 trillion export opportunity in ocean-based industries. And you'll see the segmentation of that here around the sectors that are described here in terms of seafood processing, tourism, and so on. And Kirsten mentioned the effects of ocean acidification on tourism. And we also know that COVID has had a big impact on tourism. But the blue economy may offer a way out of that. This 2.5 trillion value report is exciting. It's well worth a read. It's quite an easy read, but it also says it's a conservative benchmark. It's a conservative number. And that we're starting to see more and more countries are beginning to realize that they've got these blue economy sectors. There's particularly a significant growth in China's market share. But there's also a need for greater access to environmentally sound marine technologies. And that's what I meant earlier about we have the technology, we can do these things, we've just got to get the investment into our seas and ocean. And many states are seeing the blue economy as a way of recovering from COVID. Particularly in the Caribbean, I've noticed, and the Indian Ocean, there's a World Bank initiative to unleash the blue economy of the Eastern Caribbean states, and that is particularly focused on a post-COVID recovery. But exactly as Kirsten was saying, more data and better reporting is required. So it is not just a case of scientists out there gathering data about ocean acidification or rising sea levels or increasing sea surface temperatures or whatever it might be. It's not just an academic and scientific endeavor. This is a human endeavor, and we must bring together the scientists, the technologists, the corporate investors, and our governments if we're going to address it. UNCTAD also pulls out ocean economy pillars. You may wonder why I'm talking about all of this, and I'll come back to it at the end. I will go local in a moment, but I wanted to make the point out of these ocean economy pillars, how it really pulls out those points. It's about the economy and trade. It's about the environment. It's our social benefits. It's about our scientists and our academic approach and our governance. We've got to bring it all together. It's really frightening. It's really big. It's huge. And most people shy away from that. When you talk about this scale, they shy away from that. But this is what we've got to address. It's not dissimilar. It's bigger, but it's not dissimilar to the global approach to tackling COVID. I know that's been patchy across the globe, but it has been a global approach. We have shown we can do it, and we have shown we can do it in a very short time frame. So this is what we've got to do. And we're starting to see it. When I started out from this, I left the service in 2012. I was often patted on the head when I talked about the blue economy, and people said to me, Nick, you'll get over it. It's just another concept. It's not. It's a concept that's here. It's being addressed. People understand it increasingly. We're starting to see better definitions. We're starting to see sectoral alignments in countries like Canada. Ireland has a fantastic blue economy strategy called Harnessing Irish Wealth. Any Irish politician that you speak to will tell you that Ireland is 1/10 land and 9/10 sea. We're seeing countries like Bangladesh. Bangladesh, I would say, is one of the leading blue economy countries internationally. And we're seeing Pakistan addressing their blue economy. In fact, my own company is involved in a study to baseline Pakistan's blue economy funded by the World Bank. So we're starting to see this concept becoming more defined, better aligned with national economies. We're starting to see strategies and policies emerging. We're starting to see relationships across regions. A lot of it is at the policy and strategy level. Countries and governments are realizing that they have that natural capital, but they're not quite at the stage of implementing things. And that's what this particular presentation is about. And you'll see in a second, how do we actually get on and take that policy and that strategy and implement it and get benefit from it. So what is the blue economy? This is a clip from an old EU pitch, which I happen to think captures it pretty much the best way I've seen it. It's this sustainable use of that natural capital to achieve economic growth, to improve livelihoods, create jobs, and yet preserve the health of the ocean ecosystem. It's a big old ask, but we're going to have to do it. We have traditional sectors. When I started out, aquaculture was one of the new sectors. Now it's starting to be merged into the traditional sectors of marine transport, oil and gas, fish processing, and so on. But it's actually about these new elements. It's about ocean energy, offshore wind energy. We're going to hear about solar in a minute. We're about desalination and achieving water security. And it's about all the common skills and the marine spatial planning, that need for data, that building of a picture, that ability to see and understand our planet that I talked about at the beginning, this sea vision. It's about all of that. How do you pull all this together? If you don't address it this way, then all you're doing is, and it's not to be demeaning, but you're going to find yourself just focusing on fish processing. But there's so much that fish processing could do to improve the impact on the environment. It's got to be understood as a whole. And MARES fits into this, and you'll excuse my childlike PowerPoint skills, but I wanted to show that MARES as a project, and I'll come on to MARES in a moment, fits into this and pulls together all these elements in a way to achieve local effect in an island state to address the opportunities and the state of our environment. One of the most encouraging things we've seen recently is increasing efforts to bring funding into the blue economy to address some of these issues. Countries like the Seychelles issuing blue bonds. We're beginning to see government investment. We're definitely getting investment from Asian Development Bank, from the World Bank, from other major investors who are beginning to make this push into the blue economy. And we're seeing a massive growth in technology accelerators. This bottom right-hand graph here, I'm now going to be showing my PowerPoint skills by bringing up my laser pointer. It's very exciting. Down here, this is the founding of marine tech innovation hubs in the USA. You can see this massive growth between 2015 and 2019. And we're seeing more and more blue economy clusters, more and more approaches to achieve technology investment in the blue economy. So this finance issue is really important. And this is what I meant by the boring stuff. It's the policy, the strategy, the implementation plans. It's getting things moving. It's getting that funding in. It's getting that terrestrial public understanding of the seas and oceans. It's hard to do. It's not sexy yellow things that go down to the Mariana Trench. This is about making it happen. And it's a long, persistent slog. And within that comes a need for regenerative business models. We need to make this credible. We need to make people realize that they can earn a living out of it. We often hear about IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, global international crime, terrible treatment of people who work at sea. It's often described as an unsustainable criminal behavior. It is an unsustainable criminal behavior, but actually, sadly, it's a business model that works. People don't go to sea to fish illegally because they like fishing illegally. They go to sea to fish illegally because the governance, the management of the sea space, the control of the sea space is such that they can make a good living out of it. That's why they do it. So what we've got to do is to move from these unsustainable, attractive business models, and we've got to create sustainable business models that can regenerate our seas and oceans and enable us to put more back in than we take out, but are also legal behaviors. They're business models that are attractive to people to invest in. That's what we've got to do. So it's that understanding that we've got to take we've got to make the management of our sea space as good as the management of our terrestrial space. And that's the challenge that faces us. So here's Mares, this marine aquaculture, marine energy, reefs, and ecotourism for ecosystem services, a real mouthful. But really what it's saying is we want to make that shift from unsustainable, linear, extractive activities into high value, regenerative marine industries that are designed to support an island state and to enable them to get benefit from their sea spaces. And so can we use marine renewable energy to create alternative fuels such as ammonia to make hydrogen? Can we make that into an export market? Can we create hubs in island states or other coastal states that then can export hydrogen or alternative fuels that can be a crop, a green crop? They could be used locally for transport and industry. They can be used locally to create nature-based defenses to address those ocean acidification issues locally and to attract high-value tourism to see ocean regeneration in action, as it says at the bottom here. And particularly, can we create multifunction offshore infrastructure? So rather than just a wind farm or just an oil rig, let's have an oil rig that's been designed through life, right the way through post extracting oil to be a habitat for natural resources. Let's think about this thing as a whole. Can we have wind energy generation combined with aquaculture and mariculture and restoration of fish stocks and so on? We've got to think about this thing in a holistic, joined up way. And so Mares is focused initially on a couple of island archipelagic environments, Palau and the Marshall Islands, and amazing sea spaces. Just have a little think about this. Palau has a land area of 460 square kilometers. It's the 43rd largest EEZ in the world because its sea space is 604,000 square kilometers. It's mountainous. It's got a tiny population. It's only around about 20,000 and a pretty small GDP. Marshall Islands, if you want a big EEZ example, to a small landmass, 181 kilometers squared with nearly 2 million square kilometers of sea space with remarkable resources in it. But they don't know what's there, nor do we know what's there. 19th largest EEZ, but quite a big population. So how do these island states, which are right in the frontier, right on the front line of the climate change effects that we all know about, ocean acidification, rising sea levels, all those sorts of things, how do we give them the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of the resources, that natural capital in their sea space? I love this. This is Marshallese stick chart or stick map. Steve Peters reminded me of this yesterday. This is how these amazing islanders have navigated around the Pacific for the last 2,000 years. The sticks are the roots and the little shells are the islands. And using the currents and the stars and the winds, this is how they navigated. This is how they knew where they were. These are people who've lived with their ocean for thousands of years and they really understand it. So these are people who are right at the front line. These are people who have got this opportunity to turn around our downbeat message about the seas and oceans and to make it an upbeat message to address our seas and oceans, and to create that harmonious blue economy that sits in my nirvana. The technology is already here, and we've heard a lot about them over the last year in the MARES program. There's a link here for the ADB data room, which we can share afterwards. We've heard all about different kinds of marine renewable energy and how we can use that to regenerate coral reefs, how we can use it to create marine aquaculture. I talked about hydrogen and ammonia, how we can move from rigs to reefs to give us a more regenerative ocean approach, and about ocean thermal energy conversion. And we're going to hear about floating solar from Agostino in a moment. So the point about this slide is that MARES starts with renewable energy. That's the basis of this. Let's move off carbonaceous electrical generation and onto renewable energy. Check again. There's just so much power to be had out there. This is what the opportunity is out there to the right at 2030. This is from the International Energy Agency Ocean Power Report, showing that this is the amount of energy that is available out here in a sustainable development scenario. But you can see the trend of what we're achieving is tiny. So we've got huge opportunity, but we've got a really massive climb to achieve that sustainable power. But the point is, that's the data. And we need an annual growth of about 23% to achieve these sustainable development targets. So we've really got to shift to this renewable energy quickish. There's loads of different technologies here, different kinds of paddle systems, floating wind, tidal technologies, and so on. But looking at this data from the World Ocean Atlas, this is thermoclines. This is the difference in temperatures of the sea, the water column, as you go down quite deep in the water column. And this is Okinawa's OTEC plant. So really, the answer for the island areas that we're talking about in Palau, Marshall Islands, the Pacific, and Asia, the answer is OTEC. Now, what's the question? Well, it's actually floating solar as well. It could be some elements of wind. But if you want a 24/7, 365 a day, persistent, measurable kilowatt hour from regenerative renewable energy, it's probably OTEC. But OTEC is at an early stage of acceptance and public awareness. So there's a lot of work to be done. But if we could create these power plants, if we could generate this energy, there'd be so much that we could do. So MARES is a long-term plan to realize the opportunity of the blue economy. And it's one of the, there are lots of people out there talking about these sort of implementation plans, but it's one of the best that I've seen, and Asia Development Bank's right in the lead here. It's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years planning. It's starting, it's not expecting something to be delivered immediately. It's going to take time. It's going to start with initiatives to create zero carbon electricity. I mentioned OTEC, I mentioned solar. I said that we should have offshore infrastructure that was designed to be in harmony with the environment, that local environment that Kirsten talked about. It could be combined with aquaculture and mariculture. We need to have a pilot project to get power on the grid. We need to have initial operating capability, full operational capability. We need to have viable business models that will get the investment in place, that will enable us to shift into an island power grid that is zero carbon. You've then immediately got some nice big ticks. You've got ecotourism, because all the hotels will be running off renewable energy. The local economy, the micro, the small, and medium-sized enterprises will all be running off renewable energy. They'll be building their training and their capacity to grow their new renewable energy economy. The fisheries become more advanced. They'll be able to bring in mariculture. They'll be able to use these different industries to help with coastal legislation. Unfortunately, there's more boring stuff in here. There's got to be some legislation that enables this to happen. There's got to be investment. And that governance of that sea space using that sea vision that I talked about has got to be created. As a result of that, we'll move into a phase of alternative fuels being used for the island economy. I talked about water security. We might then get to a point where we can start exporting those crops. And these things can happen in parallel across these boxes, but it's going to take that time to do it. And eventually you should end up with an island economy and a sustainable coastal zone and EEZ. You'll then have that harmony that I talked about, and then hopefully you'll be in a positive feedback loop. And you'll have moved from linear, extractive and unsustainable human activities to regenerative and sustainable. So that's the concept for MARES. The takeaway is you can start, you can get some pilots in place, but once you start this, you need to be in it for the long haul. We've got to get into this virtuous feedback loop. You'll be pleased to hear I've nearly finished. So to recap, from that linear approach to regenerative blue economies, Sea Vision lets us see what's going on. We just got to get all that data in, as Kirsten said, let's understand it, let's plan innovatively, let's have a drive to manage our sea spaces. The technologies are here. We don't have to worry, don't have to build any more new technologies. Of course, there will be newer technologies, but don't worry about, have we got the technology to do this? We have got it. What we haven't got is the investment to get them out there to sea, to achieve that MARES ambition. And we need those viable business models that people will want to invest in, to make their living out of, to support their families. And that's going to require regulation and a method of monitoring. William Gibson was a science fiction writer, actually in the 1990s, but he was quoted in The Economist in 2003 as saying the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. We need now to crack on and get it distributed. I'll shut up, Steve.
Thank you, Nick. You're very kind. Very thought-provoking presentation. I just wanted to follow up on a few points. The UNCTAD report said 2.5 trillion worth of potential investments. Just to put it in perspective, 2021 global economy was $93 trillion a year. Global debt was $226 trillion. Fossil fuel subsidies were estimated at $5.7 trillion. So let's just assume we cut half the fuel subsidies and gave $3 trillion to this activity that we were talking about just then. We could then turn that into a $5 trillion or $6 trillion industry. So we're talking about a very large piece of the global economy potentially, and changes. And it's not just islands, it's littoral states as well. So Nick, I really appreciate that. And we can't underestimate the human-centered capital of this, and also the need to be careful that whatever we do, we look for the unintended consequences and we constantly map that. So carrying forward from Kirsten's work about the decade of oceans science decade for sustainable development, we need to work in concert with this. So our next speaker is working on a separate TA, which is the Preparing Floating Solar Plus projects under the Pacific Renewable Energy Investment Facility. So this is going from the policy strategy side to actually the hard side of let's get in and let's do it. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Team Leader for that TA, Agustino Miguel Garcia. Agustino, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good afternoon to all, or good morning in my case. The idea under this TA was, and following exactly what Nick just mentioned, was to look at another dimension in terms of using floating solar, not only floating solar for generation of electricity, but actually to go beyond floating solar in impact socioeconomically the 11 countries in the Pacific Islands, and make sure that floating solar would enable other business models and other opportunities for sustainable development. Why is this not going?
We've got your presentation up on screen, Agustino.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to change the slide.
Oh, Deb, can you go to the next slide?
Oh, okay, it's down. Okay. So first of all, a word of acknowledgement to the Asian Clean Energy Fund, established by the government of Japan, and the fact that this TA is being developed under the Clean Energy Financing Partnership and being administered by ADB. This TA focuses, as I mentioned, on 11 countries in the Pacific Islands, Kiribati, Tonga, and Kiribati, Tonga, and Tuvalu. The federated states of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Vanuatu, Cook, Nauru, Palau, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands. So all of them have been ranked in priorities in terms of development. And these countries represent around 15% of the globe space, 2,000 islands, total land mass, quite a substantial amount, and a population of 1.5 million. So that is why maybe the attention is not there, just not a lot of people. Sorry, I still struggle to get this going. I don't know why. Should I go back? Sorry? All right. So we looked at the critical vulnerabilities in the peak 11. We earmarked some of them. And in terms of, just highlighting one of them, because that's the one we found more related to the topic of this workshop, was the Reefs Vulnerability. And so increased sea surface temperatures, rising sea levels, damage from tropical cyclones, tsunamis. It was a very recent one in Tonga, as everyone knows. Decreased growth rates due to the effects of higher carbon dioxide concentrations. So we saw that there is really the need for the peak 11 to actually look at the solutions, specifically in terms of electricity, but not only in electricity. Next slide, please. So we looked at something that is common and has been actually done in other projects, which is to look at the productive uses of energy. Productive uses of energy is everything that actually makes economy go. So it's not only about electricity, but the usage of electricity for something which is productive, agriculture, commercial, industrial activities, whatever. We looked also at the nexus. So we've connected actually and tried to connect electricity to the main points in every economy, and not only specifically for the peak, but in this case, of course, focusing food, water, circular economy, transport or transportation, and mobility. So we understand that by using renewable energies, in this case, floating solar, we will not only support the countries to meet their national determined contributions, but to also to greatly help improve the marine ecosystem health and their own socioeconomic conditions. Next slide, please. So Nick already mentioned this. There is a good potential to actually use floating solar with aquaculture. So we have analyzed how we can actually bind the both of them together, and we arrived at the conclusion that FPV can actually reduce water loss. That would be, I think, one of the major important advantages of using it, with maybe 70 to 85% reduction, maintaining or helping to maintain clear water and a good cycle of nutrients. It can also allow, of course, the water pumping systems on aquaculture by providing electricity. It can also power LEDs, which can also use to regulate the photo period of the animals and plants, and of course, make them grow faster or in a different way than in a natural environment. So FPV and aquaculture can actually go very well together. Next slide, please. Aquaponics, something that we looked at, and it's something that comes together with aquaculture. Aquaponics basically enhances the capacity of the soil, and in this case of the water, in terms of nutrients, to avoid the usage of chemicals, the usage of a lot of bad stuff actually that comes with aquaculture. So aquaponics enables actually the sea to be the soil that is not actually available or so readily available in the peak 11. And that can dramatically change the life of the people on those islands, to actually provide them with something they don't have right now and they have to import, which is obviously food. Next slide, please. Another important point that was also highlighted by Nick, which is the reef growth. Reef growth can actually be powered by electrical current. And again, electrical current is something that we provide with FPV. And we have a shelter also. We have an area which can be protected. So actually, and we gave the example of in the slide of BioRock, which is one of the processes, one quite successful one. So FPV can actually be coupled with reef growth, and that provides substantial benefits for the local communities in terms of harvesting more fish and better fish, and also from a sustainable perspective in terms of the reef ecosystem. Next slide, please. We moved to the water side, and we looked in the water as in two directions. One of them was desalination. So potable water is another major issue in the islands, one that actually requires a lot of energy. 44% of the total cost of desalination is actually energy. It's actually the power that you need to run the desalination plant. So if you bring in FPV, that will dramatically change what you can do in terms of water desalination. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. So the next is pumped storage. You can use FPV within the reservoirs of hydro to make sure that you are able to generate power and still using something that was otherwise would actually end up empty. So there are definitely great advantages using FPV and pumped storage. Next slide, please. Circular economy. We believe that FPV can power the circular economy. This is something that is necessary at the regional and local level, and FPV can power all those infrastructures to actually, allow for the whole circular economy to be actually mimicked and mirrored in the Peak 11 ecosystem. Next slide, please. Green hydrogen was already mentioned. We wanted to make sure that hydrogen can actually be used as a carrier, and the great advantages as hydrogen is the carrier, and FPV can also actually be used to produce electricity, which obviously after can actually be used to generate hydrogen. Next slide, please. And then the one last point that we covered was mobility. So we understand that people need to go from A to B. That does not intentionally or directly or linearly means that you need a vehicle or that you need a lot of vehicles, but you need some kind of a vehicle. And electrical vehicles let's say in a general way, is kind of the way forward in terms of using not only cars, because maybe all of you are thinking in four-wheelers, but also two- and three-wheelers, e-bikes, e-scooters. All of that can actually be powered by charging stations connected, as the image showed, to FPV. So, I've been talking about FPV, and my apologies, people may not actually relate FPV to anything. FPV means floating photovoltaics. And I'm taking this image that you see right now as I finalize my presentation to give you an idea what it is. So it's really a platform out there in the water where solar PV modules are mounted. And with that, you use the area that otherwise would actually continue to be empty. And by using FPV in the water, and that's exactly what the Peak 11 have the most, it's water. We can actually enable all this potential nexus relation that I mentioned using money that would actually be used for electricity generation, but also enabling all the options that I mentioned, creating a new revolution for the Peak 11, creating options and socioeconomic opportunities for development, creation of businesses and jobs related to different economic sectors, and even developing their own local businesses, not only importing stuff, but actually creating local ecosystems from circular economy, all the way creating options in food, in water, in transport, and as I mentioned, in mobility, which means also e-boats, which I'm leaving and finalizing my presentation. There's a full deck with all the slides where actually there is more. You can go to the next slide, thank you. Yeah, there's more after, for those of you who have more than 10 minutes to listen to me. And I thank you all for the time, and over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Agostino. I really appreciate the fact that I know you're not very well at the moment and that you have fronted up early in the morning. It's very much appreciated. And what's even more appreciated is the drive and the story. I was sitting there going, yeah, let's do this. Let's get this done. So I was very, very much appreciative. Thank you. So what are we going to talk about next? I think it's time for a panel. And I think we've got a great panel in front of us. I'm going to introduce three of my colleagues, Dr. Cindy Cisneros-Tianco, who's the Principal Energy Specialist at ADB's Pacific Division, and she's the Project Officer for the Floating Solar Plus projects under the Pacific Renewable Energy Investment Facility, which Agostino is working on. Next is to introduce my friend and colleague, Alex Burrell, who's the Principal Investment Specialist at ADB's Private Sector Infrastructure Finance Team 2. Alex works in the Philippines and the Pacific and really gets this idea and is very keen about it. And then Gary Krishnan, coming all the way from Malaysia with his good hand, which he broke recently, is the Senior Country Specialist at ADB's Southeast Asia Division. And Gary works on regional cooperation and integration, which is this idea of sharing resources amongst people. Gary's also a team member of the ADB TA, the MARES TA. So, gang, we're talking about what we've seen so far. Given the significant environmental risks and the wealth of opportunities, are you seeing much movement in this space? Are you seeing activities? Maybe I might pass over to Cindy for the first answer. Or is Cindy still there? Oh. Alex, we'll go to you first and then we'll go to Cindy, okay?
Great. Thank you, Steve. I thought it was very interesting when Nick said that these technologies exist for marine energy, and they must be piloted, invested, and scaled. What we really need for financing these projects, we need affordable financing, and we need long-term financing. The reason we need long-term financing is that this will help to keep the tariff low and to help the power tariffs to compete with conventional power. So some of the issues that we have, particularly if we talk about new technologies and pilots, is that few banks like to take the risk of new technology. They want predictable technology and predictable cash flows. The cost of long-term financing is also very high. And pilot projects for new technologies are typically small, and there's often limited available insurance in the market for small projects. Having said all that, the good news is, well, ADB is very much focused on doing these pilot projects. And we have access to credit enhancement tools to reduce the risks. So investors can come to us and ask us to review potential pilot projects for us to review and do the analysis. And an example perhaps of our credit enhancement capability is in the Pacific. We have the Pacific Renewable Energy Program, where we have provided a letter of credit to backstop the offtake payment obligations of the power utility. This is something that we've implemented just very recently. We also have access to concessional funds to help make cases more bankable. And I think a very important feature is that ADB acts as a catalyst to attract other lenders, because our due diligence is extensive. We have the experts necessary to review all of the new technology and to diligently ensure that we can make an investable case to bring in additional banks. And the fact is that once you get additional banks to work on new technologies, there is then a catalytic effect of other banks then being prepared to try and roll out those projects. So again, as Nick had said, we're looking to pilot these projects, invest in these projects, and then demonstrate their scalability going forward. I think the key message we have is that the private sector within ADB is actively seeking new technology projects and ocean energy projects to finance. And we're under Strategy 2030. We're now very much focused on doing smaller projects with bigger development impact. So we are slowly refining our ways to do smaller projects faster using long-term financing. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Cindy, perhaps we might pass over to you and see how you see things, how things are moving.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. And I hope my internet will hold up. Yeah, so the TA was born out of the idea that the Pacific region in particular faces multiple interrelated challenges. And we needed projects that will have cross-sectoral solutions and integrate nature-based solutions to be able to address these multiple interrelated challenges. As we know, the Pacific is the most vulnerable to climate change, despite them being least responsible for it. And energy, like climate change, is cross-cutting. Energy fuels all infrastructure, or development and economic growth. So the way we see it, small island states like the Pacific region, or what we call fragile and conflict-affected situations, are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In fact, it is an existential threat to them. So this is where ADB can play a crucial role in helping them not only become resilient in terms of technology or in terms of survival, but also in terms of financial sustainability, ecological sustainability, as well as social sustainability. Because as we mentioned, this is an existential threat to the region. So we are seeing now that the green growth should turn to be increasingly blue, to go into the blue economy. So we're looking at colors now. We integrate green technologies into these gray, standard proven technologies and maintainable in a way that it will address the comprehensive challenges of the region, be it climate, energy, transport, food and water, health, and environment. All of that are going to be addressed by some of the productive uses of energy that we are trying to promote under these TA. So apart from the floating PV structures themselves, the TA is also looking at how private sector can finance not only the floating PV, but also these productive uses of energy as additional revenue streams to make it more attractive for the private sector. So what we are having then now, the vision for the future is in fact that private sector will not will give the electricity for free and just get the revenues from these productive uses to offset that. So it then it also helps the communities and the region itself, because we know small island states, they're large ocean states. Just to get back to that, they have among the largest exclusive economic zones. Kiribati actually is number 12 in the world. And the smallest one, Samoa, is 96 out of 199 countries. So this is where the opportunities really lie. We're starting with nearshore, but we can, of course, go to offshore with looking at potentially even alternative fuels production from large-scale floating PV structures. The rationale behind also using PV, because it is the least.
We're losing you, Cindy. You might need to go to audio only.
Technology.
Yeah, we've lost you, Cindy.
And because of the land constraints in the region, it is available. That is available for them to tap audio.
Yeah, that's much better. Just
Are you still able to hear?
Yeah, we can hear you well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, the idea is, of course, not even to pilot, because some of these technologies are already proven. And some of these are already, there are several examples already globally, not only on floating PV, but productive uses of energy attached to floating PV structures, including, aquaculture, vertical farming, hydroponics, and all of that. of course, we have electric ferries as well as fish farming, aquaculture, and PV charging of electric vehicles. So those are already present. It is just a matter of ADB being able to come up with bankable projects and support the small economies there. So what we are also trying to do is do some more regional approach to get the economies of scale. That's why we're doing joint procurement. We're looking at designing projects across several DMs by combining these small projects. And that's where, you know, from the sovereign point of view, we will be able to attract more, shall we say, stable and reliable private sector participation in the region. So I think I'll stop there and give it over to Gary.
Thanks, Cindy. Gary, before you go off, I just wanted to jump in on one point Cindy made, is that we sat down with a napkin about 2 years ago, and we worked out that if we used 1% of all ADB members' exclusive economic zones, we would produce enough electricity to displace the world's electricity demand. And if we turn that into hydrogen, we'd probably displace about 30% of natural gas or hydrogen fuel to X. So the opportunity is phenomenal. And then that leads on to you, Gary. You know, how are we going to tie it all together across countries and regions?
Yeah. You know, hearing today's hour or so and being involved with the Maris TA, I honestly have to say I'm so glad I'm not at the frontier of research like all our distinguished speakers today. Coming from pure operation, it's a bit more hopeful. It's not so bleak, mainly because we get to bundle solutions as well, you know. So here's some positive news at action. As you said, I'm from Southeast Asia Department, and I'm involved at both the regional cooperation level and the country-specific level. At the regional level, I understand both Thailand and Malaysia have begun to produce guidelines in the adoption of a circular economy approach to decommissioning all rigs into reefs. As you know, as everybody knows, because there are considerable savings generated, we hope to have a regional approach this year. At the country level, CIRC will be supporting Malaysia in developing green city action plans for cities across Malaysia, across the country. So over the next 5 years, we hope to enhance the achievement of sustained and inclusive growth in urban centers as envisioned under the 12th Malaysian Plan 21 to 2025. Now, the reason why I mentioned these TAs is, unlike the two TAs, the Maris TAs and the TAs that was the FPV TA, these are very generic TAs and got nothing the kind of intensity and level of research that you guys do, or the level of knowledge and skill. And yet we are beginning to see, you know, like at the regional level, rigs to reef, and you know, the ability to produce quality infrastructure, green and climate resistance. So it's encouraging from my point of view that very generic TAs are also following this path. I very much like Nick's Lambert's phrase that he used, to engage and educate the terrestrial population. So I think if we could ramp up interventions and support initiatives like I just laid out, I'm quietly hopeful that things will improve. I mean, they have to, but there you go.
Yeah, they have to, Gary, spot on. Guys, we're running a bit tight on time, so I'm going to ask the three of you to give me 3 words that come to mind. This is like a psychiatrist test, right? Give me the 3 words that come to your mind when I ask this question. When do you see these approaches being mainstreamed? And do you think we can do more? And do you think that as the decade goes and we discover more about the risks and the interrelationships, that we need to be a bit more careful. So 3 words. Alex.
3 words. First of all, I think collaboration is important between our sovereign colleagues and between the private sector in order to make these pilot projects more bankable. Second word, faster. We have to have simplified processes to do smaller pilot projects. And finally, I think motivation. I think we've got the motivation listening to the real state of affairs in these presentations. Thank you.
Good on you, Alex. How about you, Cindy? 3 words.
I'd like to think we need to be agile. The first word is agile. We need to be right solutions as well as approaches and well, money, resources to go into it. Another word would be facilitation. So we facilitate the solutions. As ADB, as a bank, we are solutions facilitator. And I would like to add to that integrated solutions, again, looking at cross-sectoral, multi-sectoral approaches. And my third word would be, well, I guess we just need to be sustainable in every sense of the word.
Okay. Gary?
None of the other speakers are listening to you. You just said 3 words. So I'm going to use my discretion and give you 6 words. Yes, we can do it now.
Okay. Malaysia
Yes.
Boleh.
2 words.
Okay. All right. One of the things that came out of that was, which we sort of didn't, no one actually said, was the 1ADB approach, which is looking across the knowledge side, the operation side, the private side, the side for public partnerships and everything else. So now we get to go to the Q&A, and we've only got a few questions in the Q&A thus far. Notably one from Joy Bailey, which is for Agostino. So perhaps we might want to do that straight to Agostino, and I'll just read it out if you don't mind, Agostino. On floating solar examples in your TA, apart from capital expense, how much would be the O&M? Is the overall cost reasonable for other local governments and coastal communities who may not have subsidies and grants? I think this is sort of focused on the diesel displacement, fossil fuel displacement. I'll hand it over to you, Agostino.
Thank you. I think one good thing of renewables had always been a very, very low OPEX versus CAPEX. So OPEX is definitely not the issue in any PV and will not be an issue in the Peak 11. That is a very good thing. It's got to be done on boats anyway. They live on boats, so that's not a big issue. It's just a matter of training, understand what is needed in terms of servicing the FPV platforms. So yes, we are very much aligned that O&M costs will be able to be borne by the local communities. They will be able to do it with a very low cost without any need for subsidies in terms of O&M. And yes, for example, also in Kiribati, under one of our projects, STREP, we are also doing that in the sense that we will have 1 year of O&M, which is aiming at exactly giving that capacity to the people to understand how to do O&M. We will probably try to mimic the same approach for FPV in the sense that if it's not O&M contract, at least training and capacity building so that people can take it over. So the answer to your question is definitely yes.
Thank you very much, Tony. Agostino. I was going to ask, I was actually got a bit confused. I was going to ask Tony if he would like to ask a question of everybody. Tony is also working on the floating solar TA. Perhaps you might, Tony, anything come to mind?
No. I think Agostino has been covering the TA and also the productive uses of the TA quite well. So I will leave it to the audience to ask the questions. Okay.
We're a bit light on for questions, sadly. Perhaps I might then ask Nick Lambert to, in the chat, we've been seeing a few things about how we scale things up. You're very close to the City of London, which is a financial hub. Are you seeing a lot of people in finance industry approaching you and saying, how do we get involved? And are people seeing this as the next big thing, like the new .com? Sorry to say that, but what's your take?
Sadly not. And in fact, as I was listening to the comments that Alex was making, I don't see big investors. And I thought, Alex, you made a really interesting point about you picked up on pilot projects being difficult to invest in and high risk. And you made me realize I must think about it as I give my presentation again or in the future, that the point of the pilot project was that's just the starting point. And you don't go in and do a standalone pilot project. It's got to be a pilot project which gets power on the grid, which has got a clear route into what in the military service we call initial operational capability, and then in the fullness of time through to full operational capability. So, for example, in the context of the MARES TA, we want to come up with a plan which shows that over the course of 5, 10, 15 years, this is how you will get kilowatts onto the grid of, say, Palau to achieve zero carbon. This is what the infrastructure would look like. This is what the cost would be. Right, where's the financier? And that's what I think is the difficult trick. I'm sure we've got a fabulous audience out here in the Healthy Oceans Forum. But how many of them are terrestrial financiers? How many of them are really seeing this blue economy thing that I'm so passionate about, that we're so passionate about? So how do we get that story? I'm afraid this is a question that's bouncing around, isn't it? It's gone Tony, me, and now back to Alex again. How do we get to that terrestrial investment community this opportunity?
Yeah, it's a very good problem to identify. I think one of the things that's come out of today.
I'm hoping Alex is going to chip in, Steve, as well. I saw her. Just don't forget Alex, because she was there poised to comment.
Oh, sorry, I was just trying to put a question in the chat. Go for it, Alex.
So in my many years of financing energy projects, I've seen over time what happens is that we only need to do 1 or 2 small projects as a pilot project to get the interest of other banks. And then the other banks come in. Initially, banks will come in and they'll demand the world because they want to cover off all their risks. And over time, when they realize that they're being too conservative and they're not going to be in the deal and they're not going to be part of the transaction, they slowly start to drop those requirements. And an example is in Asia. Certain countries in Asia started to say, the power utilities said, guess what? We're not going to give you a government guarantee for our offtake obligations anymore. And there was outrage and everybody said, well, we're not going to finance you. And then the first one stepped in and said, okay, we'll do it without a government guarantee. And the next one did. And eventually it became more of the norm. These Asian economies are now moving ahead without government guarantees. If you move to smaller areas like the Pacific, government guarantees will still be required, but ADB is very good at finding workarounds, and we only need to do 1 or 2 of these projects before new lenders start to get comfortable that these things are achievable, they're doable, and these loans actually will get repaid, and more projects will come out of it. You can rely on the private sector to deal with the competition. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right about ADB's role in catalyzing that. And I think you're also right that we only need to do a couple of projects and demonstrate success, but also show where potential for failure is to get people moving on it. I agree with you. And I think that's something that we need to focus on. And the takeaway from that is that both TAs, Cindy's TA and my TA, need to talk further about aligning in the order of battle and sharing and collaborating on resources so that we can actually get a very good product out at the end of it, which people can follow that doesn't conflict. Got another question for FPV. Have you looked at the impact of shadowing on the environment? Is it applicable to deep water rather than shallow water and lagoons? It's from Ross Newcomb. This is a question I know that's been raised. It's an environmental standards question. Agostino, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, Steve. I think there's another one before that, which is the area of PV from Ross. I don't know if you saw that one.
Well, perhaps you want to answer both of them.
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay.
I think that there was a very interesting question. So the question was, what is the area of PV required per person now and with potential future development? So that's exactly where we are busy with. I don't think there's a number, and that number really depends on how each peak, how each country is aiming to develop itself. So we are looking at exactly every single country, what is their needs in terms of electricity, what are their potential needs and targets and priorities for the productive end uses, so that we are able to enable other sectors also to be electrified, decarbonized, and become made sustainable. And that depends again on each island. So for now, our priority one countries, as I mentioned, are Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Tonga. Fortunately, Tonga, with the recent tsunami event, we will definitely not bother them anymore with FPV until they clean everything, and we help them to clean everything. But from Kiribati and Tuvalu, we have seen that, for example, in Kiribati, maybe 10 megawatts of FPV is what we need. In case of Tuvalu, which is much smaller, probably something close to 2 or 3 megawatts, eventually 4 is what we are looking at. Anyway, this is preliminary. We know more about Kiribati, but in Tuvalu, we are making progress. I was actually finalizing the grid study yesterday to identify exactly the capacity that we can put into the system. But for the productive uses, we want to enable more. So it's not going to be so much demand generation. Demand generation, the typical exercise, we want to enable more than that. So our roadmap, and one of the outcomes of the TA, is to have an FPV roadmap that enables FPV to be the driver not only for electricity generation, but also for socioeconomic development in each country. And that means, of course, their priorities: food, water, transport, mobility, and circular economy as well. So this is something which is ongoing. So sorry, I don't have an area for you, but at least I gave you some numbers on megawatts that we are looking at and the scale that we are looking at right now. In terms of the second question, and also to not leave the other countries out, this main 3 or the 3 priority one doesn't mean that we are not working on the other ones. We are. The other 8, we are also identifying 3 projects, FPV projects per country, which can be actually included in that roadmap. So overall, we are looking at this TA at 33 opportunities in the peak 11 or FPV, which will enable development at the local and regional level. And this is what I believe the TA aims to obtain. I hope, Cindy, I've done the good job on passing the message. And the second question is, sorry, Steve, I think there's another one, but okay. Impact of showering on environment. Yes, applicable to deep water rather than shallow water lagoons. Yes, this is one of our major environmental concern, one that has always been there for FPV. We don't want to cover every single inch of water with FPV. That's not the objective. Also, FPV structures are not completely closed. The objective, and do not forget, the objective of floating PV is to benefit from the cooler environment. And that means open areas, below the modules. Modules are also not placed horizontally. So they are not actually, again, totally covering the water. So there will be possibility of light going through. There are limitations in what we consider to be areas to be developed by floating PV. We'll be looking at that to make it sustainable. We don't want FPV to become a nuisance or something that is environmentally negative. We want it to be environmentally positive. So yes, we are looking at not shallow or so shallow environments, but some of them are actually as shallow as we can, because shallow means obviously lower cost in terms of anchoring and also more secure structures. So there is a linkage between the shallow and also cost, as well as security of the design of the floating PV. And of course, when we cannot, and the reef ecosystem is very important to be maintained, we are pushing the structures to, of course, less shallow waters, but we are doing that obviously in a careful way. So yes, we are definitely taking that into consideration. Thank you.
Kirsten, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just on that, also on this environment factor, and I find it very exciting also for me, a little bit out of the comfort zone, to hear about too many new technologies to be developed. Just a little really seeing this, what you have said, it's difficult to find maybe investment for those pilot projects, but also seeing the science helping those as an investment and not only a cost. Quite often the science related to those observing as well the environmental impact, I think is it's seen as a cost and not an investment, but I think it's helping those technologies, and also having what we discuss here, those new technologies to obtain energy, having this in a sustainable way, and so not having it as a blue growth, which growth always is kind of endless. So I think we have to really have it, look at it in a holistic way, so that it's not only a healthy planet but also a healthy ocean with our technologies. And so I think I'm very interested to work with all of you as well in the future, and I think there's a lot of potential for this in a sustainable way. Yes, just that.
Thanks, Kirsten. We were very, very keen to work with Goan and UNESCO as well. Cindy, you were going to answer the next question from Gerardo. You need to turn your,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, thank you. It's a very good question. And I guess the answer cannot be short. Might be better for Gerardo to send us an email with some details of their proposals, its location and all of that. And then maybe we can have a much better or more relevant response to it. But definitely, I mean, SDCC as well as our operations departments could look into it and explore potential financing.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to everybody who's presented. And
I just make a comment before you sign off.
Sure, Tony, go for it.
Yes, please. Not a question, but a comment. I'm involved as the team leader in the TA, and I've worked on PV. This is the first time that we see a combination of PV doing something beyond electricity in the Pacific. And I want to say that Pacific countries are a perfect example of what can be done to produce benefit beyond electricity production into all these areas that we've been looking at. And I think they also can be a really good example beyond the Pacific region. And I hope that can happen very soon. That's all I want to say. So, and I also thank the ADB for doing this work.
Tony, you're a champion, because that's exactly what I was going to say in the roundup. But anyway, first of all, thank you to everybody who's presented to ask questions, and thank you to everybody who's helped put up this presentation. I was expecting it to be a little bit more downbeat and probably a little bit more functional, but actually it's been quite positive and good. And I agree with Tony that these use cases give us a great opportunity to create wealth, to create well-being, and to create resilience. And I think that's the core to it, that we have a way forward. We've got to focus on the way forward. Yeah, what's behind us is quite scary, but we've got to move forward. The challenge is going to be, are we going to be able to move forward and solve these problems quickly enough and convert to a low carbon economy or a negative emissions economy, and also look at regenerating those processes that create our oxygen and sequester our carbon? And they're two separate things. They're not like, oh, we're going to emit more, but we're going to do more of this work. We need to do both negatively. So increase the capacity to capture carbon, but also to stop the ability to the emissions of it. And the question is, are we going to find over the next decade, during the UN decade of ocean science for sustainable development, are we going to find out more about what we can and can't do? For instance, we know a little bit about shading from solar. We're probably going to find some more unintended consequences. But I think this is a very live area of work. And I think we're going to find investment. And what's been very interesting in my work is that a number of the large oil companies have come and spoken to us. And, should we be talking to companies that make petroleum? Well, these companies realize that they've got to change their businesses. And what might be very interesting in 10 years is there will be a number of large oil companies that no longer exist. And there'll be another bunch of large oil companies who make 70% of their production through renewables in the ocean. And this is the way we're going. And if you look at the share prices of some of these companies like Ebola and NL over the last 2 decades versus the major oil majors, one's been getting smaller and the other one's just been getting bigger. So we are making the change. There is money available. And I think our role as a group is to demonstrate there are capabilities to get entrance. And I greatly appreciate the commentary of Nick and Agostino talking about locally focused solutions. That was very, very helpful. I'm very glad we got both you gentlemen to talk. So on that note, Thank you very much to the production team for this session. And now I'm going to hand over to two of my other colleagues from the ADB to talk a little bit more about the forum today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.